What is to reflect? To create a system of feedback that feeds back literally into your either calculation or sensory coordinates the information that you just experienced. So, but this is interesting because what that type of intersubjectivity creates, both for Husserl and for Merleau-Ponty later, is in a nutshell, is the problem of solipsism. Why solipsism? Because what it does, it assumes that interobjectivity on the one hand is more about the objective nexuses of bodies, right? Or machines. For that matter, they're the same. From a Cartesian point of view, a body is a machine, right? Is a machine with, and a person, a cogito, a cogitating person, is basically a machine with a mind. But that's an epistemological take. It's not an ontological analysis. And that's why in the beginning, there is no contradiction between the Husserl's Cartesian meditations analysis of intersubjectivity as resulted or as posited from an ecological constitution of a primordial reduction. In other words, I'm sensing, and as a sensing agent, I'm already including a priori structures through objects in the world into my being. By that, I'm replicating myself as others. I know right now that I'm talking to the laptop, but I know that you're doing the same thing. So through this type of mirroring, I'm actually creating or establishing an objective subjectivity that is not defined or finitized by my actions. Even if I decide from this sort of perspective not to speak for 5 seconds, I still take part in this sort of intersubjective continuum. And this is absolutely in accordance with the Deleuzian perspective of what he called pure immanence or pure difference that I will talk about later. But what is, and that's what I wanted to highlight here, what is the possibility of the paradox of solipsism? It is that even though we established, as in Husserl's Cartesian meditations, that intersubjectivity can never be purged out of the subject or the object, but it's both. It's objectivity internalized and subjectivity externalized. One have to assume as a procedure, which actually Husserl continuously affirms as a methodological procedure, not as a metaphysical assumption, but as a methodological procedure. The order of ascent is always from the individual being, the cogito, onto the intersubjective. So it's from the monad, in the Leibnizian sense, and that Husserl also refers to, the monadological kind of ascent is from the irreducible cogito, opening up to the intersubjective problematization of other subjects. And the first other subject to myself is my body. So, in other words, the caveat of intersubjectivity as explicated in Cartesian meditation is precisely that intersubjectivity is always defined from the cogito outwardly to other cogitos, to other others, or alter egos, other than myself. If you want, in a Lacanian sense, the first formation of the ego of an infant is the mirror stage. Because the mirror stage not only becomes a speculum of oneself, but it becomes also the image of otherness of oneself. And what is the ultimate otherness? The machinic or the body constitution of the ego, which is in the kind of Michel Henry's take on Lacan, on Merleau-Ponty, it would be the skin ego, Angers, right? The skin ego, or the flesh of the world, becomes the kind of not just simply the boundary, but the very procedure of delineating otherness. So that's exactly it. And for Husserl, that stands for what he called a static constitution. Why static constitution? As opposed to the genetic constitution, which I'll move on to talk about in a minute, static constitutions are based on what Husserl regards as active synthesis. In other words, on how the subject or the cogito is able to generate the world from its own kind of process of cogitation, or becoming involved in consciousness. I would actually argue, if I follow both Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, that consciousness is simply a performance of thinking. And I repeat that. Consciousness is not a category, as Kant already understood, and it's not a way to predicate cognition. Consciousness is a performance of thinking. I actually think that it has even deeper root in Greek philosophy, because the Greeks' two main contributions to humanity, if you want, or to intelligent agencies, is theater and philosophy. And theater and philosophy share a common denominator or construct, which is the stage. In theater, you stage things as occurrences or events, and in philosophy, as in Plato's dialogues, you basically stage a dialogue between two talking heads or agents, so to speak. In the case of Plato, often it's Socrates that plays the kind of protagonist or antagonist. So if I go back to the notion of cogitation, the cogito is the first departure point for the static phenomenological constitution. In other words, what happened to us today when we started this seminar is that each of you gave, in the static sense, a cogitating or a thinking process that stemmed out of your own personal cogito. And once you did that, you introduced individually us and yourself to different levels of objectivity. When you said, when I see a painting, when I imagine a painting, I imagine an expressionistic painting. And then I saw an expressionistic show in Dresden. And then I actually used to see it in my college, and so on and forth. So in other words, the individual proliferations were layers of objectification of the first act of cogitation, which stems from the transcendental ego. Now, let me say a few words about the transcendental ego that is actually pertinent also to Deleuze, and often is contrasting the Deleuzian point of view to the Husserlian. And I think it's actually quite superfluous in many ways. And that is the Deleuze take on self in the Humean sense is, as Hume calls the self, Deleuze calls a self a construction. In other words, the egological self is a construction. It's a posteriori, it's not a priori for Deleuze. And many critics often cite that position of Deleuze as contrasted with the Husserlian notion of the static constitution.